If we are in the phase of create, we're focusing on ideation and prototyping, and we don't think about how do we want to present it later on. Creative work is always very close to ourselves. So when we show something that we have created, it feels like we show ourselves. The first most important thing that you need to do for building a great culture is externalizing your thoughts. Creativity is all about being curious all the time and asking questions. For creativity, it's especially important that you apply that thinking of doing a lot to find something that works. And that applies for drawing. As you know, sometimes you have to draw a drawing for multiple times until you get the right one and you find the right way to do it. And that's what creativity is about. You need to start doing something, get feedback, and continue iterating on that. I see a lot of people not emphasizing sharing enough. They might have a great idea, but they have a very mediocre presentation. We're not asking questions enough to understand, not to create, not to test, but just to understand what we're talking about.
Hello and welcome to our next episode of Agile Insights Conversation. Today with one of my good friends, Holger Nils Pohl. Holger is the author of this book, Creating Clarity. I've been through it. It's an amazing piece of art. We'll show maybe some of the illustration here as we go through this. Holger will introduce himself in a few moments, but the topic of today's conversation will be creativity, clarity, and communication. So a lot of the things that he covered in his latest book, but also a lot of the things that Holger has been doing with organizations, large and small, for the past 15 to 20 years. Holger, welcome to the show. It's great to have you, and I'm already looking forward to the conversation with you.
Thank you for having me, Sohrab. Glad to be here.
So, Holger, I mentioned earlier, let's start with you giving a brief introduction about yourself. I'm sure some of our viewers already know you based on all the good things that we spread around your work in the past few months all over LinkedIn, but maybe some of them don't know you yet. So give them a few sentences like who you are, where you basically come from, what kind of work you've done, and then we dive right into the topics.
Right. So what I do nowadays is I'm being a multi-passionate creative, and I'm helping my clients to create some clarity so they understand their problems or ideas that they have, and then communicate in a better way with the use of visual tools. So that's basically where I am right now. I'm writing a lot of books on the side too. You showed one of them here in the camera. And I'm coming from like a bit of a journey, I would say, because I tried to be an architect in the first place. That didn't work out because I couldn't finish the studies at the university. It was like awful for me to do that. So I became a carpenter. So basically I'm a trained carpenter. After that, I became a communication designer. So went to university again to become a communication designer. Then I'm self-employed since 2009. So it's quite a while. And I feel quite old when I'm saying that today. But since then, I'm working in the creative field, helping big corporations, small entities as well, on their way to more clarity and working better together with better communication.
Yeah. So our path crossed, I think, in 2013, 2014, almost 10 years ago. Back then, I was facilitating a workshop in the same place as you were, right in the center of Cologne. And then I saw you doing this amazing visual. So I just jumped in the middle of your workshop, like, do you have 10 minutes later? You're like, yeah, but later. So then we talked, and then out of that, we ran a workshop where you helped us become much better in communicating visually, not just the drawing piece. People always mistake it, like, oh, I did a drawing workshop. No. You learned how to communicate visually. That's what I learned from you. And ever since then, I've been using a lot of the stuff that you taught me, and it's been incredible applying those tools and techniques when working with clients. Now, Holger, we have 3 topics, and all of these topics are connected to each other: creativity, clarity, and communication. And I want to start with creativity. You mentioned you are a creator. You do a lot of stuff. You help organizations capture their visions in a creative manner. You write your own books. You've designed board games. You've done a lot of stuff that people would consider like creative work. What is the process of creativity from your perspective? Is there a process?
Oh, yeah, I think there is kind of a process. Of course, you can never foresee like when basically an idea strikes you. So we need to be careful to separate having ideas from being creative, right? Because you can be very creative and don't have good ideas anyways for a while, and it strikes you at some point. I think it's important to separate. So for creativity, it's especially important that you apply that thinking of doing a lot to find something that works. And that applies for drawing. As you know, like sometimes you have to draw a drawing for multiple times until you get the right one and you find the right way to do it. That goes the same way if you write a book. I mean, you're writing a book currently too, right? So I guess there will not be a single sentence that you write right now that will enter the finished book in the form that you did it in the beginning now, because you need to find the right words for what you want to say. So there is always the same process of I have a loose idea what I want to do, and then I try my way forward with multiple different drafts to my goal of creating something. And the thing that every process has in common here is I have to have a loose idea where I'm going to. So starting with nothing is quite difficult. And as well, I have to keep doing it. It's not something that comes easy. So a lot of people think I'm being creative and I have a lot of fun and I enjoy my time being creative and going to the playground, basically. I would say creativity is quite a hard work because you need to keep doing it to create good and great work. You can create bad ideas and bad things pretty quickly and have a lot of fun, but that's kind of a different thing, right?
Yeah. So a lot of things to deep dive on here, right? And earlier today you texted me, you're like, Sohrab, what do you want to talk about? Right? What should I prepare? And I mentioned a few of these things. So and this is exactly what I wanted to get into, because what I've seen a lot of organizations do, and both of us work with larger organizations, is when they want to bring in more innovation, that we need more creativity, we need good ideas. Now let's do some brainstorm session and let's have some dedicated space where people can be creative. But what they tend to forget, at least that's my observation, is the discipline behind the creative process. And what you were just describing, I mean, you and I spent the past week, 3 days in a product owner workshop together. And I really valued your contributions and how you participated, how you showed up. It's like you have an idea, which in our case is the product vision or goal, and then you constantly iterate towards that idea. But in order to iterate, in order to get feedback, you actually need to do something. Without doing something and just waiting for this lightning, right? My assumption always was that that's not going to cut it. But you've been in this creative space way longer than I am, and you are much more creative than I believe I am. And it seems like you're confirming that assumption.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would like to give like a quick example from my studies at university. I think it's always, at least for me, that was enlightening. And I know a lot of people find that interesting too. So when you study design, like I did, like you're not judged by like a finishing work in terms of like doing a test or something. You're judged by what you create as a project. And you don't go to like a big hall and listen to the professor, but you come to the university to show what you have done and get feedback from the professor. So basically you can imagine like 16 students in a course coming every week to the professor, to the session for 2 to 3 hours. And everybody is showing their work in terms of this is what I have done last week. And it might be a written concept, first of all, so writing down this is what I want to do. It might be later on some sketches of this is what I think about, and then more refined sketches. But the course itself, the interaction with the professor is always the same. It's like, this is what I have done. Please tell me, is it good enough? Should I change something? What would you do? And the whole session is about you yourself listening to the feedback that you get from the professor, as well listening to the feedback that other students get for their works from the professor. Then you take everything, as well the learnings from the others, of course. Like you saw somebody doing like something in blue and yellow, and they said like, yeah, you can't do this combination, whatever it is. And you take that inside as well, and you create more for the next week. So the whole study of design is you do something at home, you create something, you bring it to the university, you get feedback, you take it back and you iterate. And that way, over half of a year, you create like a finished piece. And I
Mm.
think that's the core. You can't show up in the course with saying like, look, last week I did a really good job and I have nothing to show this week. Then like everybody's like, what should we feedback on? There's nothing to like, there's no progress. You need to show us something.
Mm.
And you have to go, like, you have basically to leave class for that. And actually, for some professors, if you didn't bring something every week, you would be right away excluded if you missed a week. So, and that's what creativity is about. You need to start doing something, get feedback, and continue iterating on that.
Yeah. So you wouldn't be able to just build something, show up at the end of the 6 month, go to the professor, say, hey, this is my finished work. Even if it was good, right? All your assumptions turned out to be right. The professor would want you to go through the process. The process
Absolutely.
of constantly building something, gathering feedback, taking that feedback into consideration, and based on that, adapting your work, refining it, and making it better. So what you were just describing sounds a lot. I mean, the interaction with the professor sounds a lot like a sprint review, right?
Yeah.
Where you,
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
yeah. And I mean, we've been talking to each other for 10 years, but this has never come
Yeah,
up.
true.
Yeah.
True.
But I think this is like super interesting because when I also think about some of the books that I've read about one of the best companies from my perspective, Apple, there's this amazing book from Ken Kosienda called Creative Selection, where he, as an engineer, describes how they built the iPhone and the software for it. And the whole book starts with demoing to Steve. And by Steve, they mean Steve Jobs. Well, it was exactly that. Like he had worked at, was it 2 weeks, 3 weeks? I don't remember exactly, but for a short period of time. And he was going to demo the keyboard functionality, right?
Right.
And he got so much feedback in that demo that, all right, I need to work on that. I need to work on that. I need to work on that. And then again, he worked on it and then he did the next demo. So very similar to what you were describing, but it's that process where you also build the discipline of constantly doing stuff, but where you also learn how to deal with feedback. Now, walk me through this. You show up in art school or design school, and you have to go through this process for the first time. How do you feel as a student? Because when you compare yourself to all your friends who are studying something else, they don't do this, right?
No.
They can show up to class or not, but it's if they show up, it's mostly like frontal teaching from the professor. They might be taking notes, then they have to study, and then they do their exam. But you have to present something every week, every other week. How did you feel?
So first of all, it's intimidating because like you have high hopes and as well like a high meaning, like you really believe in the professor's opinions as well, and of course you hope they like your work and yourself. And that is something that is a tricky one because creative work is always very close to ourselves. So when we show something that we have created, it feels like we show ourselves. It's very difficult to detach yourself from what you show. And when somebody says, like, for example, Steve Jobs says that keyboard like is crap, go back and do it like completely new, you might feel that you yourself are crap.
Yeah.
Right. So, and when I was beginning, I definitely felt that I was attached to my design. And when I got bad feedback, that was about me and not the design. So that's something I learned over time. As well, there's a lot of imposter because you see imposter syndrome, basically, because you see other people's work and you always think like, that's better than mine. And they get this feedback and I get that feedback. Until you learn that it doesn't matter because it's about the process, and coming to the finishing line is the biggest achievement, because a lot of people who show great work very early on, they will not make it to the finish line because they're exhausted already, and they often enough presented something so polished that they will be destroyed from the first feedback. Whereas when you just bring a paper prototype of a pencil sketch of something and that is destroyed, you can pivot easily, right?
Mhm.
Because it was just one like very short span of time to get feedback. So you learn a lot of things while you have that, and still it's difficult to tell people that this is hard work, because all the other friends, as you said, they go to classes, they listen, they study, and they have exams, and then they say, look, Holger, you never have exams, right? You never write a test in your studies. That's a pretty lazy study, isn't it? But
You're just
actually,
drawing.
yeah, and actually I have to work all the time and I have to show up all the time, meaning, because you said this is like a sprint, right? A sprint review. But every week, in some of the classes, these kind of sprint reviews took 4 to 5 hours. It was unpredictable how long they would take, because it depends on the feedback the professor would have. So basically you're sitting with a small group of people for 5 hours sometimes, receiving feedback for work, which is way more exhausting than perhaps not even showing up and just reading the books and then doing the exam later on.
Yeah. Now, you brought up a few things that I found interesting. So first of all, I was imagining that this was uncomfortable at the very beginning, and
Yeah.
it definitely takes time. And when I work with teams and within teams with whole organizations, like building that culture of gathering feedback and not becoming defensive and
Yeah.
not thinking that this is about you rather than your product. This is a process to itself. And one
Yeah.
of the things that helped me was you and I were at the Strategizer boot camp a few years back.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was
Mm-hmm.
2019, the last one pre-pandemic, right? And Alex shared this concept from the different hats. I think it's from Edward de Bono, if I'm not
Yeah.
mistaken.
Thinking heads. Yeah.
The thinking hats, exactly. And then one of the better responses to feedback is just saying thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Because what a lot of people do, and we demonstrate this in our workshops, is they get defensive, right?
Mm-hmm.
They try to justify, why did I build it? But just say thank you. And saying thank you does two things. It makes you yourself like deal with that feedback better. That's at least been my experience. But it also invites the other person to give more feedback. Because
Mm-hmm.
when you get defensive, and I mean, your professor had to give you feedback, right? But maybe other students, they wouldn't give you as much feedback if you become defensive. So that was one thing that I took away, and that I was thinking about while you were speaking. The other thing that I found interesting is where was I going? This sometimes happens. It's so warm here.
Well, I can jump in for a second,
Jump for a
because
second. Yeah, jump
there's
in for a second.
one more thing about the thank you. So one very important thing is, when you ask for feedback, is of course saying thank you and asking clarification questions.
Yeah.
So that means you assume that the other person is right with the feedback, no matter if you think I am right and the other person is wrong. No matter what you think, just assume the other person is right. Ask clarification questions in terms of, when you say this about the design or the idea, what do you mean by that? Or do you have ideas how we could change that? Or do you have additional feedback to this and that point that you just gave me? Or like, really asking clarification questions is so important too, because the more clarification questions you ask, you show your interest in the feedback, and the more feedback you will get, because people will not hold back anymore, because they know you want to know more details, more whatever it is very important. So thank you, plus clarification questions.
Yeah. And thanks for jumping in, because now I got my thought back in this case. And it really connects well, because what you were saying with the clarification question is creating an environment where people provide you more feedback and more tangible feedback. And one of the things that I also learned from you was, because you just mentioned that some people showed up with like highly polished work, that especially early on, if you want feedback on the overall direction of what you're doing, make it as rough as possible. Because it seems like, and that was your experience, and maybe you can talk about this a bit more, is if your work is very polished, some people don't want to disappoint you, don't want to hurt you. So they hold back with their feedback, because it seems already finished. Like, why have you go through the misery of redoing it? But if it is not highly polished, if it is very rough, they're like, oh, pivoting would be easy for him. Let me give him like very straight feedback. Can you talk about this a bit?
Yeah. So yeah, absolutely true. So I call this the difference between, often enough when it comes to drawing, about unrefined drawings and refined drawings, right? Or when I'm more open, I would say ugly drawings and perfectly done drawings, right? It is when, like, sometimes people think we have spent a lot of our lifetime in something and they don't want to hurt our feelings, and therefore they don't come to the point. For example, like, there's an example from corporate often enough. In big corporations, we build these PowerPoint slides to present a concept, right? And we spend all the time building the PowerPoint slides, and we make them super pretty, super nice. We built like 50 slides of the concept, and then we show it for the first time. What happens is that people only criticize the details in terms of, you could shift this slide to another slide, or did you consider adding this topic, or like very like detailed feedback. Very seldomly you would meet a manager who would say, look, the whole idea is not working. Please go back to scratch and
go back to the drawing board.
Start at zero, right? Because they see all these refined PowerPoint slides and they directly go into the mode of like, I can only change some details because they are that far in the process. But if you would, for example, take a piece of paper and a pencil and sketch down very quickly, perhaps only write down the topics of each slide, take a photo and put those into a PowerPoint slide, 50 slides, and show them to somebody else, they would think like, look, this is rough enough. I get the overall story, but your starting point was wrong. I think we should need to start here and there. Therefore, everything changes. You know what? It's not a problem for them to say that, and not a problem for you because you didn't spend like hours refining those slides. It was not necessary at that point. There is a point, of course, where you have to refine it, but first get some feedback on the basics, I think. It's first conceptual feedback, right? And after you clarified the conceptual feedback, you can go into the more refined feedback.
And I think this connects really well to how some of the other organizations do this. You are familiar with Amazon 6-pager, right?
Yeah.
I mean, when you're writing a Word document, there is zero time spent on making it beautiful. Yeah. I mean, making it readable on Word is done very quickly, and everybody knows that, right? But you're not thinking about pictures to include. You're not like all of that. So if you have this as the foundation for a feedback session, people tend to be way more open with feedback because they know it's easy to change this document. There hasn't been a lot of work going into making it pretty. So you immediately get into the overall content, the concept and the idea, and not so much into maybe you can like add a commata here and maybe one less bullet point here. And by the way, there you have double spaces. So that you get to a different level of conversation. I think this is very important. Now, we're already talking a bit about the concept of clarity. Now, we covered creativity to some extent. Of course, there's so much more one can cover, but my key takeaway is, creativity has a process to it, right? If you want to do it right, and there's so many great books out there, for example, Creativity Inc. about Pixar, and their very disciplined approach in creating those amazing movies that they make, which aligns very well with what you just shared. But at some point, you need to also have or build this capability of creating clarity. And this is obviously the title of your book. So I guess you have a few things to share about that. Now, how do you move to that point? What has been your experience, and how do you create a shared understanding or this clarity around an idea, which allows not only a group of people or a team, but a whole organization to move synchronized in a certain direction?
Okay, that's a big question,
I know,
and I just start somewhere. And as we spoke about creativity, we will see where it leads us now. So, I mean, there are a lot of angles to start with that, but when it comes to clarity, I think we must not stop too early trying to understand what we have in front of us. Way too early, we are happy with what we got and we continue processing. But what we should do is spend more time understanding the problem that we focus, or understand the challenge that we try to solve, or even understand an idea that we try to develop, or a product that you want to, or the customer that we work with, or the culture that we want to change in the company. We spend way too little time understanding all these things and way too much time creating something around them and communicating them. So we're way too easy to please with, oh yeah, that's why we do it. And then we continue rather than asking, and I know you like that too, the why question a lot. Like, why is it though, right? Why is this how it is? And if it is how it is, where is that coming from? Asking all those questions, that's back to creativity, by the way. Creativity is all about being curious all the time and asking questions. And we're not asking questions enough to understand, not to create, not to test, but just to understand what we're talking about. And if we spend more time there, often enough clarity comes by itself. I mean, in quotes. That would be my first answer.
Yeah. So that's, and correct me if I'm wrong, but that will be, so if we ask these questions, if we stay curious a bit longer, right? How Michael Bongestanier calls it, we get probably to clarity for ourselves. But do you also mean that this results in clarity for a group, let alone a whole organization?
Only if you externalize your thoughts and your
Exactly.
wisdom and your insights, right? So that's a common mistake of a lot of people, that they think everybody knows the same that they do, right? I'm pretty convinced that right now, when we talk about the stuff that we talk about, you, Sohrab, has something completely different in your head than I. Even though we are longtime friends and we know what we're talking about, still you will have a completely different picture of what we're just talking about. And that's the same for everybody who's listening us here. And so the first most important thing that you need to do for building a great culture is externalizing your thoughts. And I believe in most cases that's with visual tools. We talked about the 6-pager, right? That could be, of course, written words, but in most cases it's really somehow a visual. And when I talk visual, that could be just sticky notes with written words on it that are on a wall. That could be a virtual whiteboard. That could be an easy template. That could be a 2x2 matrix, or that could be a whole portfolio of visual tools that you use, depending on how complex the thing is that you're talking about. But in the moment that you put something out of your head on the surface, it does two things, I would say. So the first thing is it clarifies something for you, because you might have the same experience when you try to put your thoughts, for example, on sticky notes on the wall. All of a sudden you see where you missed something in your head because you weren't aware that there is a gap between two of the arguments, for example. But you see it when you put it on the wall. The second thing is that everybody else in the room or the company or the team can participate as well, because they now see your thoughts and they see how you see things. And it's way easier to talk about. I mean, we do this exercise often enough where I give executives, I mean, my favorite is the executive experiment here. We give them a big piece of paper and some stickers with pictures on it, like icons, and ask them, please, individually, every one of you, 6 people in the room, create a picture of the strategy of the company. And they would all create with those icon stickers. They would put the stickers on the paper. They would draw some lines in between. They would write something on top. And then they would put all the pictures on the wall. All of a sudden, although in the beginning they said, of course, we are aligned on the strategy, on the wall you have 6 different pictures, right? They are all different. Not a single one is the same like another one. And then it's not to shame them, right?
Yeah,
Go ahead.
Just a second. They all had the same pictures available. All
same pictures available.
Tickets available. Yeah. So they could have come up with something fairly similar, but they come up with something very different. All 6 of them. Yeah.
Yes. And it's not to shame them. Of course, they feel a bit ashamed because they were so confident that they are aligned. But it's more important for them to see when we say strategy, it's not the same, right? And now that we see it, we can talk about how do you see it? Why did you put this like, why did you put like revenues beside this, or why did you put the channels here and the key customers here, and why are they not connected? And then you have a very specific, and we're back to the specific and curious questions. Why are they not connected for you? For me, they would be connected. And you can have a discussion about, and that creates more clarity and more alignment, therefore.
Yeah. So you use these visual tools really as something to make a difference in understanding or a lack of shared clarity transparent, and then facilitate those conversations to ultimately get to more clarity.
Yeah.
Now, I've seen you in like various sessions with executives, but also with teams, where you capture the conversations of teams, right? Some kind of visual recording, etc.
Yeah.
To what extent do you think that contributes to this clarity among the team? Or would you rather recommend actually the teams starting to capture their understanding by themselves after they've learned a bit of this visual working?
Yeah, I think both of them can be beneficial, but I see visual recordings more beneficial when it comes to capturing knowledge in terms of there are presentations, there might be feedback rounds, there might be something to really capture in terms of output. That is often enough helpful to have somebody else listening to it and capture it. Whereas when it comes to creating clarity within a team, in a workshop about like a team-related topic or a project-related topic, I think it's more important that everybody does it themselves because it gives them more advocacy. As well, it raises the likelihood that everybody is using their own voice, meaning, so something I find always very important is when you write a sticky note, that you don't write a marketing slogan on a sticky note, but you write something in your own words that describes precisely what you mean, right? It's not like often enough people would say, I don't let me find a quick idea for that. Like often people would say, we need to have more customer focus. And they write that down on a sticky note. We need to have more customer focus. I would always ask them like, so what does that actually mean? What does it mean we need to have more customer focus? And then they say, yeah, by customer focus, I mean this, and that. And I'm like, could you please write that down? Right. And they start writing it down more precise in their own words, because the first one was like a safe bet. Like, yeah, of course we need more for customer focus, but who doesn't? But does that help us solve the problem? No, it doesn't, right? Because we don't know what it means. So be precise as well in the words that you write. And if everybody is doing that themselves, it's their voice, it's their language. Whereas when somebody else is capturing it, there is a danger of already translating it into a more general or generalistic language, which then takes away clarity again.
Now, in your book, Creating Clarity, you have this concept very similar to build, measure, learn. You call it, if I remember correctly, understand, create, and share. Is that correct? Yeah.
Yes.
Can you walk us through this a bit?
Yeah. So about the first phase, so to say, we spoke already, which is understand. And my argument again is that we often spend not enough time on understand, and a lot of people might know that from especially corporates, but sometimes from startups too, that say like, okay, we have a problem, let's solve the problem. And they jump into brainstorming, generating ideas, creating prototypes, it's all the fun. And they test it and they're gathering data and they learn from it and they build more. The challenge is that they started with the wrong problem in the first place. So they didn't understand the real problem to solve. So what you do is you try to understand first, what's the challenge here? What do we want to solve? What do we want to work on? What's the project for? Only after spending a bit time here and being very clear on that, you continue into the create phase, which is then the classical brainstorming, prototyping, finding solutions for what we have in front of us, and then continue into the phase of share. And this is important too, because I see a lot of people not emphasizing sharing enough. So they might have a great idea, but they have a very mediocre presentation. And often enough, in a lot of companies, great presenters win, even if they have a bad idea, right? And you might know that case too. There are a lot of people who can speak super, they're like great presenters, but they have bad ideas. But they will still win because they convince the other people better than somebody who's just presenting in a way that nobody wants to listen to, or it's kind of too shy, or whatever happens, right? And so in share, you think deeply about how do I want to share my prototype or idea, to whom, right? And you design a story flow, you design the presentation, and then you share and present what you have, gathering feedback, and then continue with a new level of understanding. And that's kind of the circle that you could use basically for everything. This is underlying lean startup, build, measure, learn. This is underlying design thinking. This is underlying Scrum. Everything is, for me, it's important that in whatever meeting or workshop or working situation you are, that you are aware of which phase of the project are we in right now. Are we trying to understand something? Then everything that is idea goes to a parking lot. We don't talk about ideas here. We talk about understanding the problem. If we are in the phase of create, we're focusing on ideation and the prototyping, and we don't think about how do we want to present it later on. If we are in the phase of sharing, we don't go back recreating something. We're just focusing on how to deliver the message, because we want to get feedback before we continue working on the idea. And often enough, you see teams mixing that up, even if they follow Scrum or Lean Startup, right? Build, measure, learn. They build something. This is so important, so cool. They build it. Then they start measuring it. While they measure it, they say, oh, I have another idea. They go back adding something to the prototype before they actually learned if that worked, and they spend a lot of time wasted. Being precise on the phases, I think, is important. Are we here to understand or to create something or to share? And therefore the mindset shifts, and it's much more clearer for what we are here.
Yeah. Now, this reminds me of a conversation I had, I think it's a week or two ago, with David Bland, where he briefly talked about design thinking and mentioning that a lot of teams mistakenly believe that empathizing with the customer, which is like step one in design thinking, you know that better than I do, that they believe it's a phase. It's not a phase, he emphasized. He's like, no, you constantly do that. Now, my assumption would be, although you talked about phases, that it's not like where you have a phase where you try to understand, a phase where you create, and a phase where you share, but that you're constantly using this concept of understand, create, share. You can use it within a workshop, right? Let's think about a retrospective. Like initially, you would want to understand what are the problems that we're facing and what are the underlying root causes. Then you come up with ideas. And then ultimately you share, okay, what is it that we're going to do next, right? But you will constantly apply these concepts of understand, create, and share. Is that correct?
Yeah, you could say, yeah, absolutely. You could say it's on different scales, actually. So for a project itself, it could be phases, right? We are right now in the process of this project to understand the challenge first before we start continuing creating. But then when you dial down to, for example, retrospective, you could even go down as far as, look, first we understand what question do we want to answer today in the retrospective. That's kind of understand. The create phase will be silent brainstorming on the feedback board, for example, and everybody's putting up their sticky notes. And then share will be everybody speaking up and say, this is like what I think, this is what I think, this is how I feel. That was already a full circle. And then you start like, okay, what are the solutions? So first, we have a new level of understanding because everybody put their insights on the board. New level of understanding where we are. So now the next step would be, what are the next actions? So you sit together, you go back to create now and say, we create solutions for that. We share that again with ourselves. And are we aligned? We do an alignment session on commitment. And then we can leave the retrospective with our very specific action items to change something. So basically in this type of retrospective, you would have run that circle of understand, create, share 2 times.
Yeah. Well, that makes absolutely sense. And I mean, we were earlier talking about the design process where you build stuff and then you go to your professor when you were back in the design school. I mean, it's again the same thing, right? You understand the problem first, you create something, you share it with your professor, you get feedback. Now you have to understand that feedback. Again, you go to create something and then you share it again. Now
Yeah.
let's use this as a segue, because you said something interesting earlier, and I fully agree. Sometimes, especially in big corporations, but we see the same in startups when they're pitching to investors, is not the best ideas that win, is the best presentation. And
Yeah.
that leads us to the third topic of today, which is communicate. So part of that sharing in your concept of understand, create, and share. What are some of the things that you would share with people that want to become better communicators?
Okay, another of these big questions are up.
I'm known for that.
Okay, the first thing is that's totally unconnected to visual tools is that energetic people tend to be listened to more carefully than less energetic people. So what I always do is before I present or before I jumped onto this call, for example, I primed myself that this is my speaking self, so to say, my presenting self. And I am a tad more energetic than I would be in a very normal conversation. And I'm more clear in my voice, and I'm more aware of how I say things, how fast I say them, or what I say, or what's the intonation, or how do I use my hands, even though you not always see them here in the video. So just getting into that mindset of presenting something and being confident in what you do. And the confident part is you presenting something that's not you, it's something you did, and you want to get feedback for that. You're not getting feedback for who you are. You're getting feedback for the thing that you built. I think if you start to detach yourself from that, it becomes way easier to present, because otherwise you're pretty nervous and like, what will they say about me? But
Not about my
actually,
product, but about me.
yeah,
Yeah. Mm.
yeah. And it's not about you. It's about the thing that you want to have feedback with. So that's the first one, completely unconnected to visual tools. But I think it's important to be aware of that persona of yourself and how could you level up a bit in terms of your presentation skills there. The other thing is using visual tools is important for me in the presentation. And as well, thinking about how could you present not with a PowerPoint, right? Give you like one example is, I mean, PowerPoints can be polished by anyone and everybody's somehow like really in that mindset of looking at PowerPoints in a specific way. Well, what happens if you just use a flip chart? If you just have a flip chart with five papers on it, you prepare them and you go through them step by step while presenting an idea to a group of 15 people. Makes a more intimate presentation. Everybody's on their feet, literally, because they want to stand in front of the flip chart and see what you have done. And they give you a really different type of feedback. I have that with a few clients who now, for example, present in front of the board of directors, sometimes ideas for venture capital investments just on flip charts. And what they say is, especially the board members say, it's first of all refreshing. And second, it's more intimate and private. And it feels more direct because you have that interaction in the room. Who's standing where, right? How do you talk to those people? It's not you talking to a PowerPoint presentation that's talking to them and they only look at the PowerPoint presentation, not at you. They're looking at everything at the same time, which makes it way more interesting, right? That's how you could level up. And you never need to draw any flip chart live. You could even pre-draw it or write it or just use some colors, right? Or what I often recommend is if you want to have a final touch, you bring a marker and you perhaps mark something or use a color to highlight something on your flip chart. Can be already done. You don't have to draw something live, but it's so much more powerful to do that. And then the last part is try to present step by step, right? We do that with PowerPoint slides often enough, right? You see all those slides where all the information is already visible. Some people do the same mistake with visual tools too. All the information is already visible. It's so much easier to follow a presentation if you show the information step by step. That might be that you cover up parts on your flip chart with a piece of paper and you rip that paper apart when you present that part. That might be that you flip your flip chart a few more times, or that might be in a PowerPoint presentation that you only show one piece that you're actually talking about. Because the other way around, and that phrase was, I think, from Alex Osterwalder, a shared friend, who said cognitive murder, right? When you show everything at once, but you're only talking about the first point, everybody is trying to understand all the other points already, and they don't listen to you anymore. So avoid cognitive murder and present step by step. This will be the third one.
Yeah. I think this is super valuable feedback. And as you mentioned, not all of it is connected to visual tools. I would go back to your second point. And it's interesting. This morning, I had a coaching session with one of my clients. And he had put like he had to prepare a few things, and normally people put that into PowerPoint slides. And he had also had put it into PowerPoint slides, but he had put those PowerPoint slides onto a Miro board. And I asked him, I was like, why did you put the PowerPoint slides on the Miro board? He's like, I always do that when I present to my team or to my bosses or wherever. I'm like, why do you do that? He's like, yeah, because then they can put stickies on it. So it's not only that if you have a flip chart, and now the flip chart or a virtual whiteboard would be, or a flip chart would be like in person, more intimate and all of that. It's also you invite people to contribute to your presentation. Because if you're just going through a presentation, a traditional PowerPoint, no matter whether it's in person or whether it's virtual, there's no way for people to contribute to that. No way. Right? But if you have that Miro board or if you have the flip chart in front, they can just write a sticky, they put it on that. You're like, oh, great, thanks for that feedback. And immediately it creates a completely different dynamic in that communication. And I agree with you. The moment you do stuff differently than what people are expected, you mentioned boards of directors, they usually take it as a refresher. So the other week, I was presenting to a new client, 70, 80 of their top managers were in one room. And instead of coming or showing up with a presentation, I don't do that, right? I mean, I've learned from you. I was just drawing on the iPad. And it didn't look beautiful, but they were like, man, this is so good. This is so refreshing. Like they had some input. I wrote it down, right? It gives you also the flexibility to immediately incorporate the feedback and create something, and sometimes even go off script based on how the questions in the room are and how the dynamic is changing, where you see a message is landing, and we're not. But if you've prepared everything, right? And I would invite people to try to also draw on the flip chart, then you can go off script, which, going back to creativity, sometimes you get those sparks, right?
Yeah.
And that helps you get into that. So I think just to add a few of those things to you. Now, you mentioned visual tools. What are some of the visual tools that people can easily get started with in order to improve their communication? Again, I know a big question. Sorry for that.
Yeah. Okay, so one easy way is it depends on how savvy you are and what you're willing to test. But if you want to impress people in a presentation, you could use a pencil and very lightly pre-sketch your flip chart with everything you want to say. It could be written, it could be drawn. You can take your time, right? Nobody's looking. And you bring that flip chart to the presentation and take a marker and then just trace your pencil sketches while you present. Nobody will see the pencil sketches ever because it's too light. And even if they see it, they will be impressed that you took the time to present the whole flip chart with a pencil, while you can present very easily because you don't have to think about where to put what next and what to say next. So that will be the first one. The second one would be if you could use sticky notes to present. And if you use sticky notes, I always say, if you imagine like a classical sticky note, you just leave the first third empty and write on the second third. And then you can add an icon at the beginning. And if you have a lot of sticky notes like this, you can just put them on a board, for example, while you present, which is a really nice way to present. So that would be two ways on like without digital. Then everybody likes a good story when it comes to projects and stuff. Why not think about, for example, a map? It's easy to draw, right? You could draw a map on a land, or you could draw like a map of a sea journey or whatever comes to mind. Very simple. But if you draw a map for your project and then say, we are here right now and want to get there, you perhaps add sticky notes or writing or whatever, what your goals are and what your ideas are. That could be a very easy visual tool for presenting anything about project progress or ideas where you want to get to. So that will be another one. And then we talked about the feedback. I think feedback is always it's always impressive if somebody gathers feedback in a professional way, right? And because nobody basically does that because they fear feedback. When you take the thinking hats, the de Bono thinking hats, and you have a sheet of paper and you have a yellow hat, you have first a black hat, then you have a yellow hat in the middle, and on the other side, a green hat. And just columns under that. Like you give that to people and say, after the presentation, everybody has a sheet of paper with a black hat, a yellow hat, and a green hat on it. Everybody gets that. After the presentation, you say, please, for 5 minutes now, everybody write down their feedback. If you take on the black hat, it's everything that was bad about what I just told you. Why is that idea not working? Why is that project gonna fail? Whatever it is, not in my presentation style, but about the concept or idea. If you have the yellow hat in the middle, that's everything that was great. Why will this be a great success? And the green hat at last will be additional ideas. So what else could we consider? What additional ideas do you have to what I just presented? If you use that and everybody's writing down individually, silently, their feedback for 5 minutes, and they give it back to you, if you have 20 people in the room, you will have 20 sheets of paper with feedback to what you just presented, which is way more feedback than you would ever get if you ask into the room of like, anybody feedback on this, right? And then, I don't know, 2 people say something and that's it. It's a very intense way of getting feedback, but people will be kind of impressed that you do that because they see that you're really gathering as much feedback as you can. And of course, you can ask them later for clarifying something that they wrote down. So that will be 3-4 things that I would say from the top of my head that you could use to really level up a bit.
How you communicate. Yeah, I like that a lot. No, I think the ability to capture or to gather good feedback is really underestimated. And no matter whether you're pitching ideas or whether you're building products or like whatever, right? You need to be good at gathering feedback because that's connecting it to our very first topic, creativity. That's how you learn whether the work that you've done is going in the right direction, whether it will actually solve a customer problem, yes or no, whether a customer will be willing to pay for it, yes or no. So if we think about those 4 big risks in product development, the risk of value, the risk of usability, the risk of feasibility, which is then something that the developers take care of, and the risk of viability, I think being able to gather good feedback or feedback in a good way is really helpful. Now, Holger, we talked about a lot of topics. To what extent are these topics covered in this book?
I think most of them are covered in the book, actually. I mean, there are I always forget how many tools, but I think around 40 visual tools explained in depth as well in the book. The whole process of understand, create, share is in there, even with more details how you could apply them. A lot of cases of people. And when it comes to the feedback, there's one more thing to say. I think it's not only to make the things better that you do, and not only to become better in being creative. It's as well a connection tool, right? Because every time you ask for feedback, you connect your idea to somebody else. And if people are able to give feedback to your work, they feel connected to it as well. So if you do that internally, you get more buy-in later on when you're finished. If you do that externally, you already have a lot of buyers most likely, that will want to see this to succeed because they gave you feedback and they want to see if it works or not. And so every little piece of feedback that you gather is as well something that you give, because you build that connection to people and the anticipation for a project. And I mean, that's the same with this book. So I took a bit long for this book, 6 years, but I gathered a lot of feedback during the process from even before I started to write it, which helped me getting a lot of people connected to the book before it even existed, and therefore having more people to spread the word and buy the book when it was finished. So, and that's the same for corporate projects too. In every project, gathering feedback is creating connection.
They were invested in the project, right?
Yeah.
This is really interesting. I was talking to a friend of mine yesterday who spent some time at Amazon, and he was walking me through how the 6-pager process looks like. He's like, Sohrab, everybody's talking about the 6-pager, but it's really not about the 6-pager. It's about the process behind it. Because when you write your first draft, right, you also have to think about, so who are the people that I'm going to present this to?
Yeah.
So then you invite those people to a session. Now, in that session, you share your draft. They read it carefully. And most meetings within Amazon, they start with like 15 to 20 minutes of silence.
Yeah.
People go through this. And then it becomes a collaborative session where they immediately add feedback. Now, the interesting thing, very similar to what you just shared, is after they've given feedback, they're invested in this.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean that they want this to, like, they're not going to green light this, whatever, but they're going to help you to make this become more successful based on giving you continuous feedback, giving you ideas on how you can phrase things, but especially what the concept should actually be. So I think going back to what you mentioned earlier, being good at gathering feedback, it's definitely a capability we should build. Now, everyone, as you're watching this book, Holger, where can people find it?
I mean, you can find it everywhere where you can buy a book, on the retailers online, or you can buy it directly from me on my website, which is holgernilspohl.com, my full name.com. Yeah, get it anywhere.
Yeah, don't worry, everyone. We'll put it in the show notes so that you can find the links, especially those of you who don't speak German and don't know.
Yeah, exactly.
Right, Holger Nils
Pohl. It's a long name.
Yeah, we'll make sure that you find it. Holger, with regards to time, it was a pleasure. Thank you so much. As always, I learned again. I mean, I knew a lot of these things. I've been through the book to some extent. Haven't read all of it, I have to admit, but I was part of like how it was created to some extent. So thank you for taking the time. And I'm sure that the people that go for this journey, that try to become better at creating clarity, they will definitely benefit from that. No matter whether they're building products or delivering services or being leaders. For me, it's mostly about the work that I do with my team, and the tools and techniques have helped me over the years. Thank you so much, Holger.
Thank you, Sohrab. Thank you for having me here.